I am the great-grandson of Carl Ehlers, the grandson of Otto and Melinda Ehlers. Otto Ehlers married Melinda Knutson of DeWitt, and their oldest daughter, Elaine Ehlers Goodsman, is my mother. She's still alive. She's 93. And so we spent lots of time down here growing up, visiting Uncle Alfred and Aunt Mill. In the blacksmith shop, the amazing thing to me is that when it reopened up again as Pioneer Village and I got back inside, the first thing that I was astounded by, and I continue to appreciate every time I come through the door, I always pause and I smell it, because the smell is still the same. It is, all the combination of the equipment, the heat, the pounding, the shavings from the metal, all of these things, and people just don't, they just come in, they look around, and then they leave, and they don't stop to just breathe it in. My grandfather worked here until he married my grandmother in 1921, and then because of the size of the house, then he moved my grandmother to Lowmore, and then they opened a blacksmith shop in Lowmore and bought a house, and they were in Lowmore until early 1932, when the Lowmore Bank failed, and then they moved to Follett's. So they lost their house and they lost their business in Lowmore, and then they moved down to Follett's. My grandfather did work as he could, blacksmithing or whatever kind of work as you did in 1932, when times were so bad in the deepening of the Depression. But yeah, since he was the youngest, he left with his new wife and then had children. And then my Uncle Alfred, who at that time wasn't married, stayed here and ran the old shop, started by my great-grandfather, Carl Ehlers. In some places it's listed as Charles, but Charles and Carl in German are the same. And so he stayed here. In fact, my Aunt Mill, who married my Uncle Alfred, she was one of my mother's teachers when she was at school at Lowmore. So that was amazing that my mother's teacher became her aunt, and it was always a treat to come out into their little house across the road, which is now where the caretaker lives here. And so we were very pleased when Scott County decided to preserve all of this history as a place for people to come and look back and see what life was like many years ago. That picture would have been taken in the middle 50s, and it was taken out here at Walnut Grove. And I thought, oh, that's a dandy picture of these two blacksmiths and their wives. And so this would have been somewhere, I would suspect 1956, 1957, somewhere in there when coming out here to Walnut Grove. And my parents would have taken the picture because they would drive my grandparents wherever, and it was probably on a Sunday because my grandparents liked to go for rides on Sundays unless they were entertaining, and they were big entertainers at their house. But it would have been on a Sunday afternoon that they would have come out here to see Uncle Alfred and Aunt Mill. But it's I think it's one of the best pictures of the four of them that I know of. Right. One thing I remember that struck me when I first looked in, the old red sign, all work strictly cash. And I, being the oldest grandchild, and I don't want to say I was the favorite, but we had a special relationship, my grandfather and I asked him once, is that really true? He said, well, not totally. You know, he ran accounts in his head, and everybody paid, but strictly cash was just for the average person who came in and trying to keep some money flowing in hard times. But that signs after I took the smell in. Then I looked and I thought, that struck me because that was always there. One of the things I remember about Uncle Alfred was he was a very sharp dresser, and he never looked his age. I mean, he really kept himself up. Of course, blacksmithing is hard work, but he prided himself on his appearance, and if he went someplace, he always looked 100%. And he was a very gracious, he was a real gentleman. If I had to list some of the real gentlemen I have met in my life, my Uncle Alfred would definitely be on that top 5. He and my Aunt Mill, she was a teacher. She used to sing in the choirs. If people died, she was one who would sing. She and her sister, they would do duets. And she was a very strict Methodist, and she was always, when you went into their home, it was like another world. I mean, where everybody was kind and everybody was gracious and nobody raised their voice and anger, and they lived a very nice existence. They were just made for each other. As I said, I was the oldest grandchild, and all that goes with that, and my grandparents doted on me and vice versa. And one day when I was about 7, my grandfather took me aside and he said, "No, we're going to have a conversation." And he said, and I knew right by the tone of his voice that this was a very important conversation, because he took me way off and we were just the two of us. And he said, "And you can never tell that we had this conversation." And here I am telling the world. And so much for an obedient child. But in any event, he said, particularly your grandmother must never know that we had this conversation. And he said, probably not your mother either. He said, your dad, I don't care. But he said, definitely not your grandmother. And so I stood at attention, and he said, I'm going to teach you some words and you need to know them. And then he taught me to swear in German. And when he did that, I just felt so big and important, and still do. And my grandparents spoke German. My mother could speak German before she could speak English. So when she was in Lomore, she had to, when she went to school, she had to learn English, because in the house they spoke German. And so here he was teaching me to speak German, to swear in German, and because that made his life a lot freer. So if my grandfather wanted to just really express himself, and as he was getting ready to do it, my grandmother would say, Otto, and then point to me. And so then he'd switch into German, and then he'd swear in German. And then when he was done, then he always kind of looked out of the corner of his eye, gave me a little wink and a little half smile on his face, and I just stood there. Grandma, what you don't know. As I understood every word what he was saying, and and I particularly, a couple of people he'd be more inclined to swear about, and so I always knew, oh, this is going to be a treat, keep up. So I always attuned my ears, because I knew Grandma would say Otto, and he would lapse into German, and then I would practice my German, and nobody ever knew, except we had this, Grandpa and Grandma had this wooden figure, and we called it Jigs. So when I was real little, the only one that I really had sometimes to play with at Grandma's was Jigs, because my other brother was 4 years younger, so I had to tell somebody these swear words, so I whispered them to Jigs, and I taught this wooden man in my mind as I was playing with him to swear in German. He was amazed at the number of horses, because they had the cavalry over there. Had a tremendous respect for General John Blackjack Pershing, as they all did. Talked about going over on the ship, and the camaraderie that was there on the ship. Talked about fighting over there. Since we had so many relatives that we were in contact with, since we weren't that far off the boat ourselves, and I asked him about that. Did you ever stop and think that the people you could be fighting could be relatives of ours? And he said, they made their choice, we made ours. And for him, that was it. They chose the wrong, they shouldn't have done what they did. And so that didn't bother him. But he was proud of his service, and he said, I said, did they have a, he says, many days I thought we'd never catch up, keeping all these horses, particularly after a battle. And then all these horses and getting them ready to go again, or checking them out, or to be sure what happened, getting them all fixed up, ready to go for the next battle. And so it was hard work, but he was very proud of his service. I liked going with my grandfather to shoe horses, and we would go and out in to the farms, and here at Uncle Alfred's they would come to the shop for the most part. Uncle Alfred did go out and shoe horses elsewhere, but many of the time if you came on a Saturday, the horses here could be lined up waiting to get shoed, and I can sit there watching all of the work on making the individual nails, and I knew he had it in his head, the size of the shoe for the horse, depending on who it was, and watching him do it. And if the horse was would not be under control, he had a way of, and boy, that old horse just settled right down. Most of the horses, I mean, he knew their names. He knew their dispositions. Sometimes if you don't really know horses, you think they all look alike. To him, they all had a personality. And he would talk to them, try to calm them. Once in a while, as I said, he'd have an unruly one. But mostly, he knew their temperament. He knew their name. A lot of times he'd bring a little something, a little treat for them to get them anything to settle down so that he could lift the leg and take off the old shoe and put on the new shoe. And I can remember when I saw the size of the horseshoe nail, and I can still remember the first times when I saw him doing that, oh, doesn't that hurt the horse? And he said, he explained to me the difference between a foot and a hoof. And no, it doesn't hurt them at all. He says, it will hurt them if they don't have one on. And he would fashion the shoes. He didn't, once he had sized them in his head, because all horses don't wear the same size shoe. And so he could make them up, and it's amazing how many things he carried in his head, which now we would put on a computer. But in those days, the blacksmith just did it, because if you were bringing in your horse dolly, he needed to know, he knew what kind of a shoe dolly needed. And I was amazed at that. I'm even more amazed at that today, because people wouldn't do that today. They would have all these things written out or on their little iPads, but he kept it all in his head. And so did my Uncle Alfred, as they knew those things. I'm glad that the old sign of horseshoeing and plow work still stands on the outs, because that's what it was. You could fix your plows, you could fix your horse, you could, anything you wanted. The blacksmith was the jack of all trades. You could make metal, you could do railings, you could do if it needed to be fixed, the blacksmith could probably do it. And some people thought that the blacksmith just did horses. I think horses were just almost a sideline. It was everything else, wagon wheels, all these things got fixed at the blacksmith shop for when the farmers and the people who lived out in the country, that they knew that there was a place that they could go.